welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Good morning, good afternoon, possibly even good evening. My name is Marissa Palmer, and I am a GRC professional, and I'm here with my colleague, who I'll let introduce herself. And we've just opened a poll for you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Marissa. My name is Kimberly Lancaster, and I'm a privacy professional who loves to partner with my colleagues in risk and GRC. So this is why this is a great conversation for both Marissa and I.
Yeah, we're pretty excited. I always default to, I tell everybody I'm a risk nerd. So I enjoy talking about this stuff, learning about this stuff. So, and we want this to be an engaging conversation. So please feel free to ask questions in the session chat or ask the speaker. We'll try to get to everyone's questions as we go through this. I know Kimberly just sent out a poll. It'll kind of help us gauge, how much ground we need to cover in the first couple of bullet points where we're talking about kind of the origin of GRC, real overview. We're not going to get into the weeds. And then privacy. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Kimberly, if you're okay with that. Great. Okay. So the title of our panel today is Convergence, the Evolution and Integration of GRC with Data Protection. If any of you are privacy professionals or GRC professionals or actually anywhere in the tech space, I'm sure you've heard these terms. But if you're in the GRC or the privacy space, you've really heard these terms. And they tend to be a little siloed. So we're going to talk a little bit about GRC, and I'm going to give you a little overview of its roots. So GRC could be described as a decision-making and error correction system that relies on creativity, conjecture, and criticism. And I know there's a lot of folks who say, do you even know why it's GRC? It's honestly, to give you a little bit of history there, the three letters are completely arbitrary when they brought them together. The reason they chose those areas was because it actually encompasses several different critical disciplines underneath it, but corporate governance, risk management, and compliance were historically underfunded and deficient areas in most companies. So it was to highlight those most underfunded. Plus, when you talk about the 6 critical disciplines that are under them, that would be a nightmare acronym. We don't want that. It's already enough as it is. So GRC is an umbrella that integrates governance and oversight, strategy and performance, risk and decisions, compliance and ethics. And sorry, I'm going to go back just a little bit. So these are the areas that we're going to cover today. I forgot about the slides. My apologies. Haven't had enough coffee yet. And this is the umbrella that we see. So it's governance and oversight, strategy and performance, compliance and ethics, security, continuity, audit, and assurance. Now, the reason I have risk and decisions down here is because risk and decision making takes all of the above into account. So those 5 boxes and that one little box underneath that's kind of a grayish green, are the 6 critical disciplines historically under GRC. But what we're proposing and what we're seeing as an evolution as professionals in this space is that data protection and privacy needs to also cut across, just like risk and decision does, and be integrated into these spaces to appropriately do what we need to do. So now that I've kind of covered what GRC is, I want to cover what GRC is not really quickly, because quite often we hear governance, risk, and controls. How many of you have heard that? It's not governance, risk, and controls. Controls are a component within one of these umbrella areas. It is governance, risk, and compliance. These are much bigger overarching things. It's not just a compliance program. It's not cybersecurity. It's not IT security. It's not a piece of software, which I'm hearing a lot lately. Oh, the GRC is managed. No, the software is just a tool, and it's not a consolidations department. It is so much, but it does work within those because the whole point of GRC is to, help prevent siloing amongst the organization. And so it works towards the business objective by utilizing opportunities, and that's tied to performance, and that's how we measure it, by overcoming obstacles, and that's tied to risk, and that's how we measure that component, and by maintaining obligations, and that's tied to compliance. And some of that compliance is mandatory, like regulations and certs, and some of it's voluntary, like contracts with our customers or even our vendors. So overall, it's a big space, right? And you need a lot of expertise. And it's kind of funny because I think of it like the old saying, a jack of all trades, because you have to know so much about so many spaces when you're a GRC professional. Now, I know the saying is jack of all trades, master of none, but that's actually not the entire saying. There's more to it. And it's better a jack of all trades than a master of one. And so, we always thought it was a negative thing, but it's not. Got to know lots of spaces in order to do this. So GRC's job is to maintain governance, to maintain management. So governance is the external force, controlling and evaluating an entity, which would be a company. And management is the internal, directing, controlling force within the company. And then maintaining assurance, which is the evaluation. So that's a lot. That's a mouthful, and I'm going to sum it up into one sentence. To put it into one cohesive sentence, it is governance, management, and assurance of performance, risk, and compliance so that an organization can achieve its objectives, address its uncertainty, and act with integrity to reach a principled performance. And if anybody wants to go deeper on this, I would recommend looking at an organization, and the link is in the last slide of this presentation, OCEG. They have some really great GRC stuff. So with that, now we're going to move over into the realm of privacy, which is my colleague's area of expertise.
Thank you, Marissa. Data privacy and privacy operations, data protection, they all have their own meaning, but the rise of the importance of it has continued to grow. We all see the various notifications in the news that none of us want to be in, and yet we all see the requirements coming from customers. How are you going to protect my data, as well as what we do for employees? Marissa showed on the last slide, data privacy being as the underlying, I really believe is a true picture of how this should work. Privacy operations, data protection, and data privacy all should mold around and be part of. So I like to use the analogy of, everybody know that foam spray that you put in windows and stuff that kind of just expands? That's data privacy in a nutshell. We have to fill in gaps across the organization. We support, we partner, we work with. And that's a big part of this. And one of the key factors behind all of this is that risk management, as you look at it, is handled in kind of silos. So you've got environmental, you've got your financial, you've got your cyber, you've got your privacy, you've got, regulatory risk. One of the keys that needs to happen, and where privacy really comes in and becomes that true partner with risk and GRC, is we can take a more holistic look at the world and how things are happening from that bigger, broader picture. And because of that, it's really important that there are there is collaboration. And I'm going to throw up a poll real quick here. And I'd love to get your feedback. And also for everybody's thing, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. We will definitely take time to go through those. But as Marissa's been explaining, you know, there is this view of GRC in a company. She and I have had a lot of conversations in our existing company and outside of our existing company around how to drive improvement through collaboration. You know, when you look at your own company and you're looking at some of the obstacles that you face, you know, is one of those that you don't have a partner or a collaborator or a stakeholder that you're working with. And looking at the poll, you know, you see a lot of privacy and GRC are either a collaborator or a partner. And I'm seeing some that are none of the above. That's concerning because that's that silo. So I want to stop talking. I'll leave the poll open for a little bit longer, but please feel free to answer that or ask questions. And Marissa, I'm going to hand back to you.
Oh, on the risk meets privacy. All right. So this is my favorite topic, everybody. So I'll try not to nerd out, and Kimberly's going to keep me from yammering on too much. But you know, risk is inevitable. To me, it's beneficial to my life to be a risk professional because risk is everywhere. But when it comes to privacy, the risk stakes go through the roof. I mean, we are talking about something that we are trying to get our arms around. And it's because privacy is being literally defined by governments across the world as they come up with more regimented regulation, and they are adjusting it because no one could ever have imagined the world that we live in where so much data, most of the world's data right now has been generated, and I believe it's like the last 10 years. Like, it's astronomical. We've gone from like 0 to 160 in no time flat. And so the risk is monumental, and it cuts across various categories of risk when we talk about privacy and data protection. All of us have to use the internet every single day to do our personal business and to do our work. And the cost of being on the internet should not be our privacy. It's just too high a cost, and everybody's starting to realize that. So when I talk about privacy cutting across multiple categories of risk, it can jeopardize your financial, that it's a financial risk component. It's definitely an information security risk component. The big one that I constantly hit on is the reputational risk, because reputational risk is so hard to recover from, near impossible. You've seen it. A company gets slammed really bad, they breach your data, no one ever forgets that. So, and you know, Kimberly, feel free to jump in whenever, but it is something, privacy definitely cuts across all of the risk categories. Easy.
Well, and Marissa, thank you. One of the keys here is that we have become such a society that internet is so much part of our life, that digital image of a person. And so the risk goes up. And, you know, a good example, if you look at when you go to buy groceries, do you have a loyalty card that gets you discounts in the future? That is one of the things that you think about. Okay, so I have a loyalty card. They know my name, they know my address, they know what I bought the last few times that I went to the grocery store. And they're using that data to send you advertisements. They're using it to give you discounts on future purchases. They're using it to say, oh, well, go buy our gas. You know, we'll give you so many points, you know, so much off a tank of gas. And if you think about the amount of risk that comes around that information being out there, it just really is almost mind-blowing.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to really take, as an individual, and us as privacy and GRC and risk professionals need to really make sure people understand when we're gathering data from individuals, we have an obligation to protect it, to make sure that the risks are lessened, and that we have appropriate controls in place to manage that. And
Yeah.
so that's a great definition there, but it really is a symbiotic relationship. We have to be integrated and really partnering closely to understand.
No, totally agree, Kimberly. And one of the things is that when it comes to risk, it's very hard for companies. Risk management areas in companies are quite often behind, and they don't have a centralized repository of their risk, or a risk register, if you will. And that's really important, particularly in the information security space. And integrated into that information security space should be privacy controls, data protection controls, and the such, in order to appropriately um, do this and appropriately mitigate the risk. But also the other thing that we're obligated to do as these professionals is to make sure that our customers who we're collecting data from understand in plain language, not legalese, not regulatory speak, that they understand what it is that they are sharing and how it might be used. And that's been the problem in the past. Excuse me. So we mentioned integration, and we're going to talk about some, insights into this. So as I mentioned before, GRC, I think of its primary function as a connector. Someone who is supposed to keep communication flowing between organizations, departments within an organization that tend to get siloed. And it's understandable why they get siloed, because it's kind of heads down in some spaces, just getting something done. But the function is to keep things connected by making sure capabilities are integrated, that there is interconnected relationships, and fostering of collaboration per the poll that Kimberly executed. It's good to see higher numbers with collaborators and partnering, but it's a little scarier to see some areas where there's none. This really increases your risk exposure. It's also important to make sure that we have interlinking of values and intentions. So in other words, we're all on the same page moving forward towards that objective, and that there is an interdisciplinary perspective. And that's the collaboration part, right? That we're making sure that the right people are making these decisions, helping build this framework, helping build the controls, helping build the risk register. The risk register can't be built by one person. It has to be built by an organization. Kimberly, did you have anything to add?
I did. So Marissa, you brought up that risk registers need to be managed through the organization. One thing that I think that is missed often and is an area of focus is we have security risk, we have control risk, we have risk from not meeting specific regulatory controls, we have things that are found via normal everyday processes. But often privacy risks are not thought as are not put into a forethought. They are an afterthought. They are brought forward only when something happens. You have an incident, or you have somebody asks a question, or you're going through, the privacy person's doing a ROPA, record of processing activity, and finds something that's concerning. this needs to move forward. This activity has to move forward and be part of the larger risk conversation, because again, there are things that happen. We may have security controls in place. We may have, audit and regulatory controls in place, but individual handling of data is an area that often, that's when the incidents happen. And that's when we need to really think about that privacy risk and bring that forward into that larger conversation. So my question to you is, how would you suggest, as a risk professional, that I, as a privacy professional, bring you more risk along those lines?
Well, I think that's a great question. It's a challenging question because it's about getting privacy in those early discussions, right? Privacy, because you can design controls to mitigate your risk, but if you didn't consider the privacy or data protection component, then your control may be designed incorrectly to truly mitigate the risk. So when we talk about risk and privacy together, we really have to think of, privacy as its own category of risk that works hand in hand with it, because the way we have to address, like I said, privacy is one of those things that cuts across several categories of risk. That's why in that image around GRC, it's kind of foundational in the risk. It should be an underpinning of the risk and decision making. It should be its own overarching category above the other categories. And so I always like to start from a place of risk, because I don't believe more controls make a safer or more secure environment. I believe the right controls make a safer or more secure environment. But if you are not taking into account this critical component of privacy, then you are not starting from a true place of risk. You're missing this whole section of risk that can truly devastate and undermine your organization. Because then you cannot speak confidently to authorities that you have to answer to, whether it be the EU for GDPR, or whether it be I'm going to get the acronym wrong. Is it CCPP? CCPA? It's the California one. I'm sorry. Too many acronyms in my head.
CPRA is the recent one.
Too many. You have to be able to speak confidently, and you have to know where your data is. And I guarantee you, and I should have asked you to create this as a poll, I guarantee you, I've worked at lots of different organizations, and all of them, nobody knows where all the data is. Because you may have a data warehouse like a snowflake that manages, or any other different type of data warehouse, but that's not the only place the data goes, right? The data gets downloaded, it gets pulled into tools like Tableau, it gets pulled into other tools by different teams to do what they need to do. So the data keeps moving. It's almost like an infectious disease. Like you got to go back like the CDC and map, where did it all come from, and where is it all gone, and where is it all living? And so knowing where your data is, it's an enormous exercise. I'm not going to lie to you. I've done it before, and it requires absolute buy-in by leadership and by the teams, and it requires collaboration and diligence. But once you know where your data is and you know what it is, you are so far ahead of the game, and you are truly starting from a more holistic risk point, because you've taken that into account. And now you can design your controls correctly. You can, and you have to have privacy concerns at the table, right? When they're designing new feeds and new vendors coming on that could handle the data.
Yeah.
That's a big one.
That's a big one. We could spend an hour just on vendors. So we have a question. What would be an example of a control that you would use?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah.
That is a great question. So and it's a broad question. So, Kimberly, feel free to jump in. I'm thinking about it right now. And I'm thinking about it from one of the most problematic areas for most company, which is secure access. That,
That's a great starting point. Who
you know,
has access to what?
yeah, that seems to be a challenge everywhere, because systems get bigger, companies get bigger, more integrations happening. Secure access should take into account, so most of you are going to be familiar with this language, should take into account, of course, least privileged access, and that's one thing that mitigates, but it should also take into account, and I see this done incorrectly a lot, when we look at the types of secrets managers that we use and the vault pathways that get created within those secrets managers, unfortunately, the individuals who are going to be using and the professionals who are going to be using those various vault pathways, whether they be an engineering team, a business technology team, an infrastructure team, a finance team, those vault pathways, they have not been trained or educated on necessarily least privilege access and why. I like to start from the why. The least privileged access is something that GRC professionals always want to do because you don't want excessive access. But when you approach it from a privacy perspective, there is more to that why than just excessive access. It is about safeguarding the data. So when we design a control like that, usually I think a general control would say something about least privilege access, appropriate access, pathway creation, should be, and then that gets described in the procedure. But the control itself should also speak to not just least privilege access, but safeguarding of critical and sensitive data or personal information. It should literally spell it out in the control, so that way there's no confusion. And that's the difference, right? A secure access control that hasn't taken into account least privacy or data protection will say least privileged access, appropriateness of access, and timely removal of access without any comment on data protection or privacy. And what it is, because it's more about who has access to the system, when it should really be about who has access to the system and what data is in that system. And that second part is what's missing when we don't design the control correctly.
And that's very accurate. The control defines a way to monitor. I think you have to step back just a little bit, and I'm going to challenge you a little bit on this one. I think you have to step back a little bit. If you don't have awareness in your organization of what your data classifications are and what they mean and how they're used, and that it's not just the data that you have in your production environment, but it's the data that your operations team is using, it's the data your customer support team is using, it's even the data that your HR team has on your employees. That awareness is so critical to starting to define where things happen. Part of this is we've got a great conversation going on in the chat right now about ways to do this work.
Yeah, no, I saw the asset management spreadsheet and I'm like, yes, because that's also missing.
Yeah. From a privacy professional perspective, I use ROPAs to understand the process that the people are going through. I ask a lot of questions. I read their documents. I look at stuff. I have them walk through. If they have access to a production environment or to sensitive data, confidential data, that they're going in daily and doing something in the system to make it happen because it's not automated, or there's a vendor that is doing this for us through a tool that they provide for us. Understanding that interaction and getting your people in your organization to really understand the importance of data classification and how to call out if they're seeing stuff in their day-to-day work is one of the key factors to really starting to define. Otherwise, your privacy person, your risk person, your GRC person are running around chasing everybody every day of the week. Empowerment of your partners and stakeholders is one of the best ways to start to move things forward.
Absolutely. It's just like security. You keep hearing security is everybody's responsibility. Well, so is privacy. These two, there's a lot of back and forth, and there's going to be some leadership who are going to say that these are very separate areas. But it's the siloing that gets us in trouble in the first place. Okay, so they cannot be separate. The education has to happen. It might look different, but it's a very similar approach because people need to understand. And honestly, what I have seen is when you make it personal for people and you explain the why, nobody wants their data. Nobody wants to have their identity stolen.
Yeah.
So why would you do a bad job of safeguarding other people's data? Because if you're not safeguarding other people's data, then you can guarantee that somebody isn't safeguarding yours. And
we, the vendor comment has come up, and we all use vendors in one way or another, but really understanding how that vendor is touching the data, what they're doing with it, how they're protecting it is really complete. Now, Marissa, we've got a question in the chat
I
here.
saw it. That's a great question.
I'm going to let you take that one.
Yeah. So the question for everyone, in case you're not looking at the chat, is how would you continuously execute on access controls outside of quarterly reviews? I guess making that process more proactive. That's absolutely where you want to get, is to that proactive. You want to remove yourself from a reactive environment because we all know how exhausting that can be. I would say this is where automation, this is where even AI could come into being a really beneficial space. So we do quarterly reviews too, where I currently work, and it's not enough, right? Because if we're talking about timely removal and making sure somebody doesn't have continuous access, that could be days from a data perspective, a data protection perspective. So what needs to be done is a monitoring of removals and reviews. So there's lots of different tools that I've seen used appropriately, but the key to making sure you can do that type of proactive monitoring is to make sure that you understand completely your feeds. Like, what is your source of truth for personnel? There should be one source of truth, and it should be what governs onboarding and offboarding. And that's also why the vault pathways, it's like birthright access. That's why the vault pathways have to be cleaned. And that's why people have to be educated on this, because if they don't know, then they don't know. So when you have workflows or a true understanding of what feeds into what and what is your source of truth for onboarding and offboarding and activation, then you can implement an automated solution to monitor access controls, and that can be your compensating control in the interim of your quarterly reviews. Hopefully that helped answer that question. There's not one way to approach that. I mean, you could do more. If you have a larger team, you could obviously do more monitoring and do it monthly. But honestly, an automated solution is better. But you have to make sure it's right. Awesome.
Yeah, great response there. Oh, my favorite phase.
Oh, compliance. Don't we all love the compliance? That's why we're here. So I really loved this quote because I've literally had, you know, chief financial officers, chief operations officers tell me, this is so expensive. And and this is absolutely true. If you think compliance is expensive, try non-compliance. The fees and the fines that governments can impose on companies are astronomical. We're seeing some of these from GDPR with Facebook. Uh, we've seen other types of non-compliance. I used to work in banking, so non-compliance for some of the multitude of findings they would have was incredible. I mean, they were huge fines, and they would do it by the day. This was the U.S. government. So um, traditionally, compliance, because it deals with some sort of regulation or framework, it's slow moving. Its very nature is so slow, very much like the law, right? But it has to be more agile. We have to be more agile and more dynamic and in lock and sync with the environment that compliance is operating in. And if you work for a tech company or you work in almost anywhere now, nothing can afford to move slow anymore. And so the goal for compliance is not to be, an additional to do for a team. What you want is the compliance components to be embedded in the processes that exist for these teams. This is compliance by design. And I think we've kind of touched on it. An ideal state would be compliance and privacy by design. This means there is full integration of compliance considerations, privacy considerations into your processes across the board, regardless of what kind of organization you are, to ensure that these processes are functioning at an optimum performance level. I think it's the best way to say it.
Fully agree. Privacy.
I'm sorry, I'm reading the chat. So
No, you're good. Privacy is like I said earlier, it really molds around everything. And I highly suggest teams, even if you're a small team, become partners, become collaborators with your GRC, with your compliance team, and
with your engineering team,
yes, that's another big one.
Because
you
quite
have
often,
to understand what their world is.
Yeah, it's a very different world than ours, and they should not see, our business partners across the board, but engineering is a big key component, and developers are another key component. They should not see GRC as the enemy.
No.
And several of them do, because that's what they've learned, that GRC is just going to come and add more to their workload. Audit is the enemy. They're just going to come and add more to their workload. And so it's really important to build really good relationships and help them understand that you're not here to make their life worse. Ideally, we should be here helping make this a more efficient space so they don't have all that extra to do. Because it's when an auditor comes in or a regulator comes in and we don't feel confident about our control environment or our governance environment and our risk environment that we scramble and we force everybody else to scramble. And it's a fire drill and it's awful. Truly.
Very true. Very, very true.
So what does this all look like operationalized, right? So I have a whole bunch of things listed here that I'm sure a lot of folks on this call are familiar with. They've seen them. They're really used to them. Oh, yeah, I just saw somebody's comment that rough time with, I can tell you that media and dev tend to be, and marketing, sorry to say, tend to be the hardest sells. They just, it's not that they don't get it, it's that they don't want to get it because they feel like it handcuffs them, right? And it limits what they can do. Again, I advise making it personal. And so if you work for a company where there are stock options, if you fail your audit, that's money out of your own pocket, if you hold stock in the company. If you make it about, that's one way that I have a tendency to make it personal for people, and then they get it like that.
Well, what's the ROI behind it for them? I mean,
Yeah.
you really have to, you mentioned marketing, and marketing actually from a privacy perspective is I often find that they're one of the easier partners to work with, because if we do it right, we drive more users to the site and you get more people, doing things and stuff. So there are ways to look at this, and really try to bring things forward. But yes, and Elias, you've got a great comment here. If you don't have executive support, that's the first place you start with executive support, so that you can then build from the bottom up and build those relationships. So
yeah, because it gives you a lot more leverage. One of the reasons in one organization I was with that we were able to do this enormous year-long plus exercise of finding out where all our data was because we had that executive support. The CIO said, we're doing it. There's no questions asked. And we're going to do whatever we need to do to drive this. And yes, excellent point, Carolyn. I saw that the CISO was charged this week. I mean, this is heavy duty. They're not playing anymore when it comes to this space.
Yeah.
So we have to do better. So all of these areas that I have listed are areas that you're probably all familiar with and you live and work in. Mm-hmm. Privacy should be involved in every single one of these. What I tend to see is like a data protection impact assessment and then a security assessment. And they're not, so it's very hard to build sometimes, but at one organization I built a common intake form so that we could assess vendor, we could assess security, well, not just vendors, but we could assess security, we could assess privacy, and we could assess data sharing, because it was an organization that had a tremendous amount of sharing of data amongst its subsidiaries. There should not be two columns of this stuff. There shouldn't be the GRC stuff and then the privacy consideration of all of this. That's highly inefficient. It's problematic. It will create bigger risk. The training and awareness should be combined to think about security and privacy in the same idea. It's the same concept. Risk assessments should have a baseline. And when you do a risk assessment, there's probably going to be specific privacy questions you have to ask that may have different outcomes. Again, it's like going back to that control example. We have a risk, and from, an information security or cybersecurity perspective, there's an exposure. But did we ask about the data elements? And then some of these are very specific, right, to privacy, like data subject rights management. I mean, this is no joke. You can't do an appropriate, and Kimberly, you keep me honest, but you cannot do an appropriate data subject rights. You can't manage that space if you don't know where your data is. You also can't respond to a subject request. Mm-hmm. And if you can't respond, then there's going to be fines.
Very, very true. Well, we're at the 5-minute mark, Marissa. I'm going to throw up one last poll and try to, if everybody wouldn't mind doing that. And again, Lisa, the DPIA is a true security assessment. I fully agree. And it's taken, in my experience, having that conversation and working with the partners is really important so that there's an understanding there. So.
Yeah, I love the comments I'm seeing, the feedback, and seeing what folks are doing in their space. This is fantastic. And I love the idea of bringing all the extra Halloween candy to the office.
Well, you know.
I'm not going to lie. I quite often bribe some of my teams by bringing in cookies or pie.
Yeah.
I'm not above it.
Nope, not at all. So, but Marissa, thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. It's always a pleasure working with you and getting to do something like this with you. We're both on LinkedIn. I think you can see it on our profiles. Please feel free to connect, reach out.
Yep.
Ask questions.
And again, these opinions are our own, not our employers.
No, so. Exactly. Thank you for that. And this is just from experience from having worked in different spaces. So, yeah, thank you all for your time and giving generously of your time by being here with us. We really enjoyed this.
Great conversation.
Be well, everybody.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.